This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. This week, Louisa Thomas joins us to talk about her new biography about an unusual diplomat and writer who also happens to be the wife of a president. Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Mrs. Adams.
She was not the one who was going to come into power, and that she wasn't going to have much of a role in the White House, and she was right about that.
What do most of us miss when we look at the plants around us? Hope Jahren will be here to talk about Lab Girl, her book about trees and other life forms.
Look really close at the rings. You can see one day in that tree's life, and it's all around you. Isn't that amazing?
Plus, Alexandra Alter has literary news, and Gregory Cowles joins us with bestsellers. Here's some fun news. Inside the New York Times Book Review podcast is turning 10. Our 10th anniversary celebration will be an event here at the Times on April 28th with former host Sam Tannenhouse, podcast founder and current book critic Dwight Garner, and Gary Steingart, our very first podcast guest. And for our listeners, we're giving away 10 guest passes. Email us at bookreviewgiveaway@nytimes.com. We'll be randomly selecting 10 listeners to attend our live podcast celebration with a guest hosted here at the New York Times. For the full giveaway rules, visit nytimes.com/books. The giveaway closes on April 17th, and prize winners will be notified within a few days. Louisa Thomas joins us now from Boston to talk about her new book, Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Mrs. Adams. Louisa, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, I'm going to ask you the really dumb question that I'm sure you're getting all the time, which is, your name is Louisa, her name is Louisa. Did that figure in at all to your desire to write about her?
Well, I do like her name. I can't lie. You know, it's true that I probably noticed her in a way that I might not have otherwise had she been named Mary or Jane. I don't think that it extends too far beyond that, but it is true that I think when you're writing about a historical figure, there has to be some sort of crack in the window, you know, and I could sort of hear her voice maybe from the first instance in a way that I might not have otherwise.
What else, other than the name, other than cracking open that window, drew you to Louisa?
Actually, I came across her letters while doing a little research about Andrew Jackson, and I was just struck by her voice. It was vivid, it was urgent, it was propulsive, it was alive in a way that seemed pretty rare. You know, she also talked about her thoughts and her feelings in a way that few other figures, at least that, you know, we sort of look to, you know, when we think about American history, seem to do. She was also very funny, which I think is one of my favorite things about her and one of the most surprising things, I think, as I did this. And so I was immediately struck by her wit.
Can you give an example?
Earlier today, I was at Harvard for lunch, which is my alma mater, and she hated Harvard. And she said some very, very funny things. I wish I could quote them for you, but about how Harvard was kind of in the worship the sacred cow of money, you know.
Nothing new.
Yeah, exactly. She's very, very incisive. And she also just had a way of, you know, she had a kind of ear for a good turn of phrase. I remember in one of the first letters I read, it was about this kind of contretemps in Washington over the wife of one of the cabinet members, and she said, "Ladies' wars are always fierce and hot," which sort of stuck with me in a way that, you know, so she sort of had this way of boiling things down. She could be very, very sarcastic, too. I mean, she could sometimes be a bit mean, but there was something appealing about that, too. She was very human.
And she must be such a draw for a biographer because she wrote so much. Can you talk a little bit about her writing?
I first encountered the writing she did late in her life, when she did write so much. In fact, she sometimes said she was seized by a mania for writing. And then I sort of got to her first letters, very late, or kind of after I'd read quite a lot. And in her first letters, all she could write about was how much she hated writing. Her first letter to John Quincy, that her first extant letter at least, it's actually her second letter, is 2 sentences. And the first sentence is this long, you know, run-on about how much she hates to write. And then the second sentence is, "I will therefore quit this subject." And then she just had nothing else to say. So, you know, one of the things that really kind of amazed me is how she found her voice. And part of that was was through her relationship with the Addams family, just writing back and forth. And part of that was that she had a natural facility with it. She was a great reader. And part of it is actually a little bit more abstract. She was very interested in what it meant to have a voice. And her own life is a kind of testament to that journey.
But it wasn't just letters and a diary, but she also wrote poetry and plays and fiction. Was she a well-known writer at that time?
No, she actually did publish a few of her poems anonymously. I mean, they're terrible, to be honest. I mean, they're very much of their time. She actually, I was looking through one of her commonplace books the other day, actually, because I wanted to find something and I couldn't find it in my notes. And she has pages and pages of words that rhyme. Some of her poems kind of are more interested in rhyming than anything else. But yeah, she did love to write, and it was a kind of both a therapy for her and a creative act. And some of her plays, she wrote a novella that I absolutely love about Washington society. I kind of wish I could have run it in full, and some of her poems were really meaningful. She, in another era, she might have been a published writer, so might have sought that out more. Clearly it helped her quite a bit in terms of just gave her kind of a sense of purpose. I remember that once when one of her sons was struggling, she encouraged him to write fiction.
The Founding Fathers obviously get a lot of attention. There are quite a number of books on them and somewhat to a lesser extent on their wives. But is it daunting to turn to a figure who is so well known, has been written about? There was a biography that came out about her a couple of years ago.
Yeah, she's sort of an interesting middle ground there because on the one hand, she has been written about. On the other hand, she's also been overlooked. Mm-hmm. So I think on different days I felt different sides. I was sort of felt, oh dear, how am I going to do this? She's been done. And on the other days I think, oh goodness, how am I going to do this? Nobody's ever heard of her. In some ways I feel like I've been lucky because I was able to build on some of the good work that other people have done. At the same time, there was absolutely new terrain. I was able to both find things that no one else had ever found and cover ground that no one else had ever found. The biography that came out a couple of years ago ends with her in the White House. I mean, it's only half her life, really. Mm-hmm. There's also a very good book that's about her that really reconstructs her journey from St. Petersburg to Paris, and it's a wonderful book, but it has a very narrow focus. And so I was able to sort of take her life in full. I was able to find a few things about her family that helped me reassess, some of the formative tensions and insecurities and questions that she had about herself. And I was able to do that pretty early. So I felt from the beginning that I was going to be able to make some kind of contribution to understanding about her and about the Addams family and in some ways about, political life in the early republic and also, transatlantic, identities. And I mean, it was just, she's such a rich topic. It felt like there's so much room, to explore.
Let's turn to her family and specifically her husband, because we're in a moment right now, of course, where we are considering the spouses of candidates for the presidency. Was she a reluctant first lady?
She was and she wasn't. She was reluctant in the sense that she would say things like, the elevation to a higher station would put me in a prison. On the other hand, she really actually took the lead in promoting his candidacy. John Quincy was sort of the last of his father's generation, which thought that campaigning was craven. It was called electioneering. You weren't supposed to ask for the presidency. It was supposed to be a reward for your merit. Mm-hmm. And he really went out of his way not to appear like he wanted the presidency. And this is at a time of rising populist sentiment. This is at a time in which more and more people were sort of taking an active role in their own campaigns. And he, Louisa actually urged him to sort of show himself. And he said, absolutely not. I'm going to chain myself to my desk like Prometheus. And she was very kind of conscious that a lot of what she did in Washington, she held a series of weekly parties. She went to Philadelphia and set up a kind of campaign headquarters, coordinating with a bunch of his allies. She counted the number of senators and, representatives that walked through her door. She was very, very conscious what this was all about. And she really put a lot of herself into that effort. So in that sense, she was not reluctant at all. She was very forward. But she was also aware that she was not the one who was going to come into power and that she wasn't going to have much of a role in the White House. And she was right about that. I mean,
was she interested in power?
She was interested in power in the sense that she wanted John Quincy to have it. Clearly, she had certain ambitions for him and pushed him. On the other hand, she was suspicious of it, and she also thought a lot about ambition and its costs, and she experienced those costs. I mean, they could be very painful. She was really self-critical and probably also critical of John Quincy, because she thought maybe that they had made too many sacrifices for the pursuit of power.
They were no John and Abigail. What was her marriage with John Quincy like?
It was complicated. It was at times very tender. It was at times very fraught. I think it was animated by real love, but at the same time, it was a real marriage. It was very dynamic. There were periods of estrangement and also times in which they really depended upon each other and supported each other. It's not easy to look at it like a John and Abigail and just think of it this kind of perfect union. On the other hand, John and Abigail spent a lot of time apart. One of the reasons why we have such a picture of their kind of idealized marriage is that they had to write so many letters to each other. John Quincy, on the other hand, wanted Louisa with him, often in places where wives are rarely found. So that does also say something about the role that she played in his life.
You come to this as a journalist, and given that we are in election season, was there anything that you learned about her, about their marriage and their time in the White House that sort of you think about now during this election period?
Well, one thing I do think, I sort of with a rueful smile, is that we think about how terrible sometimes the campaigns are to each other. What she went through was even worse. During the Jackson-Adams race, a newspaper ran an item about how she had premarital, implying that she had premarital sex and that her parents weren't married, and all. On the other hand, they smeared Rachel, and to the point where Adams actually blamed the John Quincy Adams camp for his wife's death. So I think that there is a kind of nothing new under the sun element to that.
Although it sounds like the dirty campaigning of the time was a lot cleaner than it is now.
One of the things she understood we really would do well to think about now, which is that people are governed by emotions. She once wrote to John Quincy when he was kind of belaboring a point of policy, and she said, I think you're misunderstanding this. I think that what you have to remember is that people are governed by little passions, not just by laws, and by little prejudices, and you have to connect with people in their gut, with their feelings. And there was a kind of emotional element to our understanding that I think was really I think about a lot now as I think about why certain people are, what kind of choices they're guided by.
Don't go underestimating first ladies. All right, Louisa, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
The book again is Louisa, The Extraordinary Life of Mrs. Adams by Louisa Thomas. Alexandra Alter is here now with some literary news. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So this is like sparkly Hollywood news for us.
Yes, it seems like starting your own publishing imprint is the new sort of personal fragrance or celebrity handbag line. Every actor and actress in Hollywood seems to be starting their own publishing imprint to kind of curate their list. And the latest one to enter the fray is Lena Dunham. She announced on Wednesday that she and her friend Jenny Connor, who is the Girls showrunner, are starting an imprint with Random House, which published Lena Dunham's essay collection.
What I loved about her announcement was that she said that she and Jenny are both voracious readers of books and book reviews.
I appreciated that too. And actually, there have been a lot of these. Gwyneth Paltrow just started one. Oprah, of course, has one. I mean, she should frankly have one. It's Oprah. Hers is starting with her own memoir next year. Other celebrities who you wouldn't expect have them, including Johnny Depp. Viggo Mortensen has one. But Lena Dunham, she already has a newsletter and a website where she kind of curates interesting voices. It publishes, It's called Lenny, and it publishes a lot of nonfiction, essays, cultural criticism, interviews. She's kind of using that as a springboard to find interesting voices for her new imprint. And, she's a writer herself. I think that her sensibility is kind of clear from her TV shows, from her movies, and she's going to extend that kind of brand now into publishing.
If you could pick a celebrity to start one of these book lines, who would it be?
Oh, that's a good idea. I would love BJ Novak to pick some humor writers. He's a really great writer. He's published short stories.
And a great picture book with no pictures.
Favorite among my children. And Tina Fey, I feel like, would have some really interesting
Tina
voices.
Fey?
Frankly, the person who I was sure would have one, and I Googled to find out, but he doesn't, is James Franco. Poet, novelist, performance artist. You would really think this guy would have as an imprint at this point.
All right, listen up, Hollywood. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks, Pamela.
Hope Jahren joins us now from Hawaii. Her new book is called Lab Girl. Hope, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You are a geobiologist, which is one of those job titles that I think all of us kind of can figure out what it means. But why don't you tell us exactly what that is and what you do?
Well, that's great to hear because I picked that word because it breaks down to exactly what you think it might be. Geo is the earth and bio is life. And I study the interaction between the earth and the life that lives on it. And I'm most interested in life at the very bottom of the trophic pyramid. So I'm most interested in organisms that make their living off of the bare bones of the planet, the atmosphere and sunlight and things like that. And that, of course, takes us to plants. And that's where it stops being simple. And then we start to talk about organisms that live for hundreds of years and don't move, stay in one place regardless of the weather, and put out millions of offspring, and one every 100 years actually grows up to be an adult. We get from that very simple premise into this wholly foreign world that just gives us endless joy, to roam around in there with our imaginations.
So it's all plant life that you study?
I study plants, and I study terrestrial plants. Of course, the very surface of the ocean is full of plants, but they're tiny, and they only live for a couple weeks or months. And the plants that I like are really big. They weigh a couple tons, and they live for maybe hundreds of years.
What are the plants that you like?
I like trees. I like trees, but I like all plants. I have a real fondness for weeds, for things that grow where they shouldn't, and for things that grow too well. The world is full of weeds.
The book is a kind of hybrid. It's a memoir, but not solely a memoir. It's a science book, but not 100% a science book. Certainly not an academic science book. How did you conceive of the book?
It's an interesting process. I mean, for years I thought I would write a textbook because that's what you do. You get the PhD and you write a bunch of papers and you get this holistic view of what the field is and how it's changing, and then you write the textbook that changes the way the next generation approaches the material. And that's how science increments forward. So I always thought that I would follow that model, and that's what I was supposed to do. And when it came time to write my textbook, I sat down and I couldn't do it. I tried really hard for a long time. And it turned out that I was plagued by the question of, number one, does the world need another textbook? And I was also plagued by the fact that I couldn't keep my own story out of it, in that to really show what I had learned and what I thought was important, I also needed to tell the story of how we got there. And that's how I ended up with this book, that it's not really a textbook, although if you absorb everything that's in it, I am perfectly happy to say that you have learned just as much as you would in one of my classes.
You can still assign it to your students.
I'm getting away from classroom teaching just because I feel like I have to, tell the world about this stuff. I feel like people's tax dollars have funded me for so long that I've got a new responsibility to show people what it's really like and what the joy of it is, and just share the parts that were given to me. And I'm not doing that efficiently if I do it with 15 people at a time in a room. I've got to find a way to talk to people, and this book is helping me do that.
And if you had to distill what that message is that you want to get out there, how would you put it?
I had to do that, for the publishers, and I racked my brains, and I came down to three things. Number one, plants are more alive than you think they are. And number 2, science is done differently than you think it is. And number 3, both of those things matter a lot.
How is science done differently than you think it is?
It's done by people. It's done by the heart and the hands. The characteristics that make me a good scientist don't have a lot to do with the classes that I took or the calculus that I know and things like that. I think it's that I'm so incredibly stubborn that I am not motivated by gaining praise. I think it's that I'm happy to spend a lot of hours in isolation. I have a really freakishly long attention span. I think all of those things in me are the things that I use every day to be a good scientist and that I've used to stay in the business. And those are the things I think that everybody has. Those are the things that we need to teach people and girls while we're at it. If girls are the new target population for, who needs to be a scientist. I mean, those are the attributes that everybody has somewhere. You just need to water those seeds until they grow.
Everyone's talking about STEM and girls and women and science. Is that part of why you chose the title Lab Girl?
I've had people tell me that they're uncomfortable with the title because they think it's demeaning. I sort of stand there silently and I say, well, what does it mean about the fact that you feel that way? It's taken me 40-odd years to come to terms with being a girl. And I was a girl. I wasn't a tomboy. I was a girl. I like to braid my friend's hair, and I love to skip rope and sew and cook and stuff like that. And I feel like I had to give that part of myself up to follow a scientific path because those were the days when there weren't a lot of women in science. And downplaying those aspects of yourself were key to fitting in well enough to be tolerated. And so a lot of it is about me coming back and claiming, clear-eyed, regardless of how you feel, I'm a girl and I always was. And the fact that I have to say to myself or anybody else that there's nothing demeaning about that is really hits to the heart of so much that's going on in our society between men and women.
Were you surprised at that reaction that people had to the title Lab Girl?
I was more surprised to find it in myself. A fear. What will people think of this? Will they walk by it? I'm almost 50 years old. I mean, how tragic would that be if I never came to terms with the fact that, I was a girl, and I was a scientist when I was a girl. I loved this stuff, and I loved my friends, and I loved my first bottle of nail polish, and I loved all that stuff, and it's all me, and it's time for me to stand up and integrate those parts and claim them and share them, and you can judge it how you will.
That gets into the memoir part of the book. You talk about your childhood. Your father was a scientist.
He was an instructor at a community college. It was in a very small town in a rural area in isolated part of Minnesota near the Iowa border. It was the only community college in the county, and so he wasn't just a scientist. He was the scientist. That was his identity. Just like the family that ran the ice cream store, and those kids all scooped ice cream, when they were 10. My brothers and I, we knew how to fix the equipment, and we hung around the lab while he graded papers, and we played with the stuff and set up stuff for the next day's classes, and he did that job for 42 years. And it was hard work. And somebody in my family was always working. And so that's what we did. My very earliest memories are being in the lab and playing on the floor and waiting for him. And I always assumed from the time I was very small that when I grew up, I would have my own lab because that's what people had that brought me into science. It wasn't some special program meant to interest me or help me, identify butterflies or something like that. It was this intuitive drive and this very early sense of comfort with the surroundings, my exposure to mechanical objects from when I was really little, and the fact that I was happy there. It was never this foreign place that I didn't belong in. No matter if other people treated me like I didn't belong, I knew from the moment I could know I was, that that's where I belonged. And I was always able to hang on to that.
You structure the book in a really interesting way with 3 parts: roots and leaves, the first part, woods and knots, and then flowers and fruit. Why structure it that way? What does that mean? And how do you integrate your own personal story into that?
Well, I'm going to be coy and tell you that it's because the first part has some descriptions of roots and leaves, and the second part has descriptions of wood and knots, and the third part has actual descriptions of how flowers work and fruit. And if there is any way in which that echoes the parts of my own story that I tell, I would leave that to the reader. And I would also add that it absolutely makes me thrilled, and it makes me feel just great that somebody would actually read it and take the time and energy to ponder how that all might fit together. But that's your job.
What is it that you wish that people knew about trees, about plants, and the study of them that they don't, or that they don't think of in their everyday lives?
I think people don't see trees. I've always felt, this great thrill or this power that comes from being able to say one sentence to someone and watch their eyes as they look around the room in a different way. And know that I can do that that's something I can do. I mean, what other power is there than to be able to hand someone joy on command? I mean, I can do this to you right now. Look around the room and see how much of that stuff is made of wood. You've probably lost track of we have plastic and metal and all that stuff, but the main building material that we use is wood. And now think about how every piece of that wood was once part of a living thing that was a seed and then tried to establish in the world and then spent years and years just trying to stay alive. And now it's this thing that you sit on, etc. And now look at it a little closer, and you can see that there are rings sometimes, if the wood is cut right. You can see across the grains, and there are rings. And now look at those rings and think about how they built up day by day, sitting in the sunshine. The tree covered itself over and over again, creating those rings. Look really close at the rings, and you can see one day in that tree's life. You can see across what happened in one day of that living thing's life. And it's all around you. Isn't that amazing?
This sounds so optimistic. It sounds like it's occurring in a place where everyone respects trees and we're not sort of chopping them down mercilessly.
Yeah. I mean, trees don't care how we feel about them. I mean, we're always, when we study science or when we study the environment particularly, we're always tempted to center ourselves in this way that I think is kind of absurd. When a tree is out there, it's not worrying about whether you're going to cut it down. It's worrying about whether it's going to rain today or whether something's going to chew on its leaves or something like that. It is your responsibility to wonder why you should cut this down and what you're cutting it down for. I do work on environmental science, but let's keep those two messages straight.
And that message is to keep in mind the trees.
Well, what are we doing this for? I mean, it's one thing to deforest in order to convert land to farmland because there are people on the globe that we need to feed, and there are more and more people on the globe that we need to feed. But one of the big causes of deforestation now is to convert forest into farmland, to grow those crops, and then to ferment them back into fuel. Right? So we're doing this thing where we're actually putting fuel into bulldozers to chop down trees, and then we're putting fuel into tractors to plant crops, and then we're taking those crops and harvesting them, burning fuel, and we're fermenting them back into fuel, which we then put into combustion engines in order to do all that stuff over again. And it's this crazy Mobius strip that doesn't make any sense. And so I want to say that all deforestation is not created equal. It doesn't just matter how many trees you chop down. It matters why you did it.
I want to end on a positive note. Spring is coming, albeit slowly, here to New York. What would you want listeners to look for as they see spring coming, looking around at trees beginning to blossom around us?
One thing I think that always sparks people's imaginations is to remind them that plant life is ruthless. You know, spring is the Monday morning of the plant world, and you got to get up early, and you got to get out there, and you got to grow something and claim that patch of the sun, because if you don't do it, somebody else is going to do it, and you're going to find yourself in the shade. It's stressful. It's stressful to be doing that explosive growth. And it's very stressful to guess when is the best time to do it. Now, you can say, oh, get out there earlier. Get out there earlier than your neighbor and claim that sun, and that's one strategy. But do you really want to be the first green thing on the landscape when all those herbivores wake up hungry, all those bugs wake up hungry from their long winter nap? Right, so there's a huge amount of strategy going in to the spring around you. And just know that when you see a bud bursting, that on some level, that tree chose to burst that bud right there, not the one next to it, at that moment. And it doesn't know if that risk will pay off, but it's jumping off the deep end. It doesn't use the same process you do to make that choice. But in a way, it's living its life deliberately, just like you're walking down the street going somewhere.
All right. I'm going to use a bad pun and say we'll all then root for the trees this spring. Hope, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
The book again is Lab Girl by Hope Jahren, reviewed this week in the Book Review. Greg Cowles is here now with Bestseller News. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
So what's selling this week?
Well, there are 5 new titles on the hardcover fiction list, including 2 of our recent cover models. Edna O'Brien, whose new book is The Little Red Chairs and was reviewed on our cover by Joyce Carol Oates, is new at number 16 with that book, The Little Red Chairs by Edna O'Brien. Then at number 14, another cover author, Jim Harrison, whose novella collection, The Ancient Minstrel, was reviewed on our cover a few weeks ago by David Gates. That book is new at number 14. Jim Harrison, of course, just died very shortly after that review ran.
Yeah, I think that may have been his last interview, too, that he did with By the Book for us.
I think that's right, yeah. So a little bit sad he doesn't get to see that book hit the list, but it is the first time that he has hit the print version of the bestseller list.
He's been on the extended list.
Yeah, with a couple of books, The Great Leader and also The River Swimmer back in 2013.
So Legends of the Fall, which was turned into a movie, never made it onto the list.
It never did. That book was published back in, I think, 1979, sometime in the 70s. And it wasn't turned into a movie until 1992. It was a Brad Pitt movie, a big success, an Oscar-winning movie. But it didn't carry over to success for the paperback version of that book. I assume it saw a bump in sales, but not enough to put it on the list.
All right. What else is new in fiction?
Well, the usual series books are new on the list. Philip Kerr continues his Bernie Gunther series. The latest in that is The Other Side of Silence, new at number 13. Then the Christian author Karen Kingsbury continues her Angels Walking series. The third book in that series is called A Brush of Wings, and that's new at number 10. And finally, Jacqueline Winspear continues her Maisie Dobbs series with a book called Journey to Munich, new at number 4. There are 3 new titles on the nonfiction side this week. Starting down at number 10, the popular historian Adam Hochschild, who was on last week's podcast, talking about his new book, Spain in Our Hearts. That's new at number 10. It's a look at American interest in the Spanish Civil War, Americans who fought in the Civil War, Americans who wrote about the Spanish Civil War.
And then we have another cover girl.
Yes, we do. Peggy Orenstein, Girls and Sex, new at number 4. That, of course, is her look at girls and sex. Specifically, she talked to dozens of girls ages 15 to 20 about their experience of sexuality and their sex lives.
And a natural segue to the next title.
Lust and Wonder. This one is a memoir, not a sociological study. It is by Augustin Burroughs, who, of course, broke through big with Running with Scissors. And this is a look at his life after rehab, so kind of a recovery memoir. Lust and Wonder, new at number 2.
I think we can call him a serial memoirist.
Yes, we can.
At this point. All right. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.